So today we're going to go to a new concept of things. Last week we did the shutter speed stuff. So today we're going to move on to aperture. So we're going to talk a little bit about aperture. So today we're going to talk about aperture. We're going to talk about a little bit about a 4th of July firework concept, if anybody wants to photograph 4th of July, and a little bit of technical stuff with how cameras work, a few little things like that. So here we go. So also too, I have to apologize in advance. We've had some issues with Canvas. That's really fun. Canvas is Latin for this is really fun. So I apologize about not getting things on there, but I've finished the videos for the first 2 weeks assignments, and I'll have those videos up in probably another couple hours later today, Monday. Okay, so let's go on to things. Let's talk about how the cameras work. So we're going to talk about what's called aperture and depth of field. So aperture and depth of field, very important concepts in our photography stuff. So aperture, you don't have to write this next slide down. Please don't, in fact. But this is the concept of what aperture is. It's a formula. But what it really means is the aperture is the size of the opening that allows light to enter the camera. So you can have different size openings that let different amounts of light in at one time through your camera. So you might have a really large opening that lets a ton of light in really fast, or a really small opening that lets a lesser amount of light in. So you may be thinking, well, why would I want to change it? Well, we'll see that. So when we talk about aperture, the aperture itself is represented by some sort of number. It's usually f2 or f5.6. You'll hear people say that. Also on your cameras, when you look at the bottom of your viewfinder, when you're looking through the camera itself or on the screen, usually at the bottom you'll see a number on the left hand side that represents the shutter speed. The number on the right represents the aperture. Okay, so the numbers determine, this part is not important. I would never test it. And besides that, I found out yesterday or last night that my quizzes aren't coming up. So I'll start them this week. I apologize. This part is not going to be on a quiz, but I always want to explain things to make sure people understand there's a reason why certain things happen. I'm going to get full screen for just a second here. Someone wants to get in. Oh, you can't see the slideshow. That's because I had, okay, so you're talking to blank, right? Cute. There we go. How's this? Let's go back here. Thank you for letting me know that. Aperture, can you see it? Let's see. Oh, this. Okay, so everybody's in. All right, so I'm going to start this again since I wasn't sharing my screen. I apologize for not sharing my screen. I sometimes forget these things. Now, doing this online, I'm great in person, but sometimes my my online skill set is lacking. All right, so aperture and depth of field. This is the formula for aperture. Don't worry, you don't have to write that down. Not that important. But aperture is, the definition of it is the size of the opening that allows light to enter the camera. Okay, so that's that how large or how small the opening is determines that. Okay. It's represented by some sort of number like f2, f5.6. There's some sort of number that we represent that with, and the numbers mean something. We'll get to what the numbers mean here. This part is not going to be on a quiz, this next bullet point. The number is determined by the focal length divided by the size of the opening. Pretty boring stuff, but basically it says if you have an 80mm lens, like a reasonably long focal length lens, and there's a 10mm opening, you'd have it, the camera will be set to f8. Don't worry, you don't have to worry about what that means or how it affects you. I just don't like to leave it out there saying you should believe this, and I don't give you any sort of substance to believe it by. Okay, so aperture is a number sequence. So you think, well, what do you mean by number sequence? Well, it's not that I sit there when I'm photographing something, I'm not doing this type of debate concept as far as what number I should choose, but the numbers do mean something. It is a sequence. So you have some sort of sequence. This is it. You don't have to memorize it. Some professors, some teachers in my lifetime have made me memorize that. It's not important that you memorize it. It's important you memorize what the numbers do and what they represent in your photography. Okay, now there's a sequence. If we look at this differently, you break it apart. If you go to every other number, they double. And you take the other numbers, they double as well. They keep doubling every single time they go there. So it's a sequence. And again, you don't have to memorize the numbers. I'm never going to quiz you on what the numbers are. If there's a quiz or a test, I'll give you the numbers. I'll just tell you which one, I'll ask you to put them in a certain order as far as things that they do. So let's figure out what is it, why do they have these stupid numbers? Okay, the stupid numbers. This is one of the things in photography that's probably not the most difficult to figure out, but sort of sometimes people have a hard time sort of wrapping their brain around what it does and why it does what it does. So on our cameras, I'm using a diagram from an old camera. Our old cameras had a dial on them that was right next to the lens, right between the lens and the body. And you turn that dial and it would actually make little clicks. It would stop. So every time you turn it to one of these numbers, it would actually stop. So a lot of times people call that an f-stop because the way the lens is operated. So long story short is with these apertures, the different sizes represent different size holes. Different numbers represent different size holes. So for example, F2 would be a wide open hole, a really large hole, lets a ton of light in. F16 is a very small hole, lets a very small amount of light in at one time. So the biggest thing to sort of come away from this is not the memorization of the numbers, but rather the idea that the smaller the number, the bigger the opening. The bigger the number, the smaller the opening. Kind of counterintuitive. Most people think, well, bigger number, bigger hole. It's exactly opposite of that. Bigger number, smaller hole, smaller number, bigger hole. It's the way it always works with aperture. It's sort of backwards. It takes a little while for us to sort of wrap our brains around that, and that's okay. We'll get it. Don't worry, it'll all make sense as we go along. So what does it look like when you change your camera from these aperture numbers? What does that do? What does that look like? Well, it sort of looks like this, where these little aperture blades, there's little metal blades inside your lens that open and close in accordance to what you're assessing them to. So if that would be F2, F16, F2, F16. So you think, okay, cool. I'm starting to get my brain wrapped around the idea of what's going on here. Got it. But what does it do? What does that make? What happens with this? Well, here's what happens. What aperture controls is what we call depth of field. And that's where our assignment is going to be on this week, is depth of field. So depth of field, the definition of what depth of field is, the amount of area in a photograph that appears in focus. So when you're looking at an image, whether it be a picture that you took or you picture on Instagram or wherever you're looking at images, you're looking at how much of that is in focus. Okay. So the definition part of this is the smaller the aperture, meaning the big numbers, the more the area is in focus. Okay. So if you have a very small aperture, which means you have f16, the more the area is in focus, the more the picture becomes in focus. The larger the aperture, the smaller numbers, means more area is not in focus. So if I'm taking, let's say so this is one way to sort of control my way of looking at telling a story with my images. So if I'm going to go to Yosemite or something like that, most likely I'm going to use the apertures of like f11, f16, things like that, because generally in landscape photography, we want everything to be in focus. We don't want to just focus on one thing. We want everything to be in focus. Whereas if I'm taking portraits, generally I'm shooting with my lens wide open, those small numbers, to where it puts the subject in focus and puts the background out of focus. Because traditionally in portraiture, and sometimes things like sports, you want the subject in focus and the background to be sort of a secondary type concept. Okay, so how does this work? Why is it that the smaller the smaller aperture, the bigger numbers, makes things more in focus? Well, not everybody did this as a kid, but I know as a kid growing up, I did this all the time, which is I did this. I figured out this is what you use magnifying glasses for. Well, what happens is when you're taking that magnifying glass and moving it up and down to get the sort of laser beam of light to, you'd never burn ants, or that would be terrible. If you were to burn ants. But when you move that up and down, you're actually sort of changing the aperture in a way. You're getting the light to sort of beam in and be more pinpoint. Another way to look at it is that if not everybody wears glasses, now I wear glasses, but my glasses are because I just need them to read. Distance I can see just fine, but when I'm up close like this at my computer, I need glasses. But if you know somebody, or if you're somebody who wears glasses all the time because you can't see street signs at a distance, this next slide is for you. What happens if whether it happens to you or you have someone with you, or you see somebody you go to like a restaurant, like a fast food restaurant, where they have the menu on the wall up above you, and someone doesn't have their glasses. What do they do in order to be able to see that in focus? If you've ever been with somebody who wears glasses like that, my oldest son wears glasses, and he's blind as a bat without them. If we're somewhere like that and he can't see it, what do most people do? Well, most people, when they do that and they don't have their glasses, they squint. They squint their eyes, they'll close their eyes and they'll squint them down, and squint down are ones like this where they close down. Well, what's happening is by closing the aperture of your eyes, it's making more of the picture in focus. So I have a GIF of that. So this is a camera in which it's going to open and close the aperture. So before I hit the GIF, because once I hit it, I can't make the animation stop. With it like this, you can see the numbers on the front of it are in focus. The numbers on front of the lens are in focus because the lens is wide open. So it's letting the most amount of light possible in, but because it's doing that, the background's out of focus. This GIF is going to slowly, the aperture is slowly going to close, and you'll see what happens is the rest of the camera becomes in focus. So let me play this GIF to where it closes and opens. So as it closes down, as it goes down smaller, you can see not only the word Nikon come in focus, but you can even see some of the background, the books and stuff that are in the background becoming in focus. So the smaller the aperture, bigger numbers, the more area becomes in focus. The larger the hole, smaller numbers, the less area is in focus. So in this whole concept of learning aperture, it's not imperative that you memorize the numbers, just memorize the concept. So memorizing the concept that a smaller number means a bigger hole, a bigger number means a smaller hole. Okay, so when we talk about depth of field, there's some other controls to how depth of field works. Unfortunately, it wasn't as simple as just changing the aperture. They got to make it tougher. Okay, so when we talk about depth of field, the focal length, the zoom of your lens also controls the depth of field. So on your camera, if you have the zoom ability of your lens, that changes it. So for example, if you have a really wide lens, that tends to automatically give you a greater depth of field. Like for this morning on my camera, I put on a super wide lens. This is like a super, super wide lens. This lens, pretty much no matter what, is going to be all in focus no matter what I do, because this lens is one I use for things like real estate and landscape and stuff like that, astrophotography. And so it's super, super wide. So no matter what I set this at, the whole thing's in focus. Okay, so if you shoot with sort of a wider shot on your lens where your camera is zoomed out a little bit, that tends to make everything in focus no matter what. The opposite is true, to where you take your lens and you zoom it in, you zoom it to where things become closer to you, that tends to give you a little bit more of a shallow depth of field, just by the nature of how optics work. Here's a more, not baffling, but more confusing one, is macro. So when we're talking about macro, that means close up. You're taking a picture of a leaf, a bug, something's close up. That tends to automatically have a very shallow depth of field, no matter what we set the cameras at. Macro shots tend to have a very shallow depth of field. Okay, so let me show you some examples. So this is a shallow depth of field. This is my younger son, Thomas, a few years back. Kid's 20 now, so this is a little ways ago. But on the picture, because I use such a shallow depth of field, you can see he's perfectly in focus. He's crisp, sharp in focus, but the background's out of focus. So there's no way you would look at the picture and go, wow, that's a really nice pool, it's clean. That's really not the point. The point is more about this kid with this intense look about to swim. Okay, if we use it for portraiture, this is a wedding I photographed, to where you can't say, wow, that's a really nice lawn they've got. That's the point of it, is that I wanted to make sure they were in focus and the background's out of focus. Okay, so that it's basically really focusing just on themselves. There's no doubt about what this image is about. It's about this couple that just got married. I also use sometimes shallow depth of field for things like when I do food photography. So I do a lot of food photography for like DoorDash and Uber Eats. This is one of the things there where this macaroni is in focus. I focus on the macaroni itself, but the background is way out of focus. So you can see the wooden cutting board that I'm photographing this on is super out of focus as it goes away from the macaroni itself. So all of those pictures I just showed you, the picture of the macaroni, the picture of the wedding couple, and the picture of my son, those were all shot where the lens was wide open. So you're talking about a number that's like f2, whatever. Every lens is a little bit different. So the smallest number possible on every lens is slightly different. Every lens is a little different. Some lenses have smaller numbers, others don't, and that's okay, but you just want to go to the smallest number possible. So for the part of the assignments that you want to do where you want to do the shallow depth of field, you want to go to the smallest number your camera has. Don't worry, I'll get more into that. So a large depth of field, exact opposite to where this is the Mission Santa Barbara, right near where I went to school. So everything's in focus from the closest point of this little fountain to the furthest point of the church and the mountains beyond. So everything's 100% in focus for this shot. This was shot with a wide angle lens. Same thing here, wide angle lens. There's Thomas, this is about 3 years ago. Arizona trip. So this is another one where it's super wide lens. I also have it down pretty small as far as aperture is concerned, and everything's in focus from the rock that's barely, this is taken with that super wide lens. So everything from the ground that's barely in front of my feet to the furthest point off in the distance, everything's 100% in focus. So I'm using both a wide angle lens, so the camera's really, really wide, but I'm also using a very small aperture like f/16 or something like that to get that effect. Okay, when we talk about macro, this is a macro shot. This is an orchid. So orchids aren't really all that big. Orchids are like the size of like a, well, I used to say $50, but nobody knows what $50 are anymore. Bigger than a quarter, let's say that. Not much, but a little bit bigger than a quarter. Anyway, so macro, even with a great macro lens, it tends to do this trick where it automatically makes the subject in focus and the background out of focus. You don't have much depth of field at all. Depth of field here is a couple of millimeters. Right? Now, if you use the telephoto lens, again, we can get shallow depth of field where we have the subject in focus here, the background out of focus, to where I focus just on that canoe and the other canoes are out of focus. Same thing here with this, this flamingo, where I focused on the flamingo and the background behind it went really far out of focus. Sometimes you might hear the term, people use the term called bokeh. And it's not talking about Boca Raton, Florida. It's bokeh as far as a bokeh effect, B-O-K-E-H effect, as far as what the background does. That's a bokeh effect, where that background is becoming a little bit circular, this really cool effect where it really makes that, to me, it really brings the flamingo's color and texture out of the picture. So what happens if we take our camera and we change the aperture of the same sort of picture? This doesn't really demonstrate it as well as I'd like, but that's what you get. So this is what happens when you shoot pretty much wide open. So we can see the flowers in focus, but you can't really make out the background. You can see that it's a building. You can't really see what the building is. And guess what? It's Mission Santa Barbara again. But now medium depth of fields, where now I'm sort of that in-between area, what we call F8. So the flowers in focus, background's getting more in focus. If we get on to F22, now the background, the flowers in focus, the background's, the church is almost completely in focus. But the problem is when I set this up, I'm like, it didn't work the way I wanted it to, because it's sort of misleading, but I'm really far away from the church. It doesn't seem like it. You think, oh, it's just like across this grass. No, there's grass, and then there's a road, and then there's another set of grass and steps. It's a really long ways away from where I am. All right, so some more samples. Shallow depth of field, where this is the St. Barbara parade in Santa Barbara, or Mission Days parade. So this young lady she's St. Barbara. Anyways, but you can see her, but the background's totally out of focus. So it emphasizes her. Exact opposite, large depth of field, where I have, this is Yosemite, where I have the camera down to like f/16 or f/22, something like that, to where a very small little opening to put the branches in the foreground in focus, and Yosemite in the background in focus as well, or Half Dome in the background. So what can we do with this to sort of illustrate different things? Well, as a person who works as a professional photographer, I can do this to illustrate different parts. So for example, one of the companies I work for create a lot of work for me, which is good, is the Catholic Church. And so I do a lot of work for the Catholic Church, and I do pictures of their cemeteries and personnel. Anyways, I digress. So I thought I had a nice set of pictures to show you the difference. So this is a picture shot like at whatever the largest opening of my lens is. So we can see the statue here in the foreground is in focus, but the building in the background is out of focus because of that. So if I stood in the exact same place, but changed my setting to where now I went down to like f/16 or f/22, I would get this instead. So now the statue's in focus and so is the building in the background. So different apertures create a different sort of story. You can tell a different story with different apertures. Okay. A couple more examples. Shallow depth of field. Some older pictures. My son Thomas. I quickly learned, my dream of being a baseball father was dashed from when I realized my son couldn't hardly catch. The other son couldn't hit. So, but no big deal. They do a lot of other things great, but baseball was not their. Wasn't in their wheelhouse. But there's no way you can look at this picture and say, wow, that's a nice, they really cut the grass well. That's not the point of the picture. The point of the picture is he's in focus, background's out of focus. So on this assignment, one of the tricky parts about this is the idea that I want you to illustrate depth of field, meaning that you have to have something that's somewhat close to you, 5 to 10 feet away, and something that's far away from that to make this effect. So ineffective would be this. If everything's really far away, it doesn't really demonstrate it. These people on these horses are like 50, 60 feet away from me, and everything's really far away. Because of that, it doesn't really effectively show the depth of field. So the concept of this assignment, and don't worry, I have an assignment PowerPoint, exactly what you have to do, the nitty gritty of what you have to do. You want to be closer. It's a weird way to describe it, and maybe there's a better way. I haven't found it yet. But I used to, in my in-person classes, I would tell people, look, when you're taking pictures of this, if you can't spit on your subject, you're too far away. This is really far away. These people are really far away. You need to be closer to sort of illustrate the concept. Okay, so let me get the other slideshow and give you the assignment, and we'll do some bonus stuff here in a second. So assignment 3, aperture and depth of field. So this one here, you want to have the camera on A for aperture, or if you have a Canon camera, you want to be on AV for aperture value. So everything you do for this assignment is on A or AV. Okay. In this assignment, you produce 6 images showing various types of depth of field. So we're going to do sort of the same thing we did last week, which we had 3 sets of 2. Same thing here. We're going to have 3 sets of 2. So to achieve this, you'll photograph subjects at various aperture settings as well as various focal length settings or zoom settings. Okay. Now, before I go on to the next slide, a couple minor things. On the images that I'm getting, a couple minor things, nothing majorly wrong. Some people are not turning stuff in, need to get stuff turned in. 2 is I don't need a full screenshot showing data. I just want an image. 3rd is I don't want a zipped file. Please, I don't know if I'm not going to name names or point fingers to anybody. I'm not even going to say if that person's in this class today. Maybe they'll be at 7, maybe they're today. It's a roulette wheel. Don't zip the files, for God's sakes, please. Just upload them. You don't have to worry about zipping stuff. If you have issues, if you have any issues at all, I can't overemphasize it enough how important it is. Please let me know and I'll step you through the process. Not a problem, but just don't zip those files. Makes life tough. All right, so depth of field at different apertures. So if we set our camera to f2.8 or whatever the whoops, hey now. Sorry, I have a microphone that keeps touching it. Sorry, so sorry. So if you have your camera set to whatever the smallest number is, this particular graphic has it being f2.8. You can have your lens you have may not go below f4 or f4.5 or something like that. Every lens is a little bit different. Some of them go lower than 2.8. Some lenses people have like 1.8 and 1.4. So it doesn't. So the number doesn't really matter. It's more important that you go to the smallest number possible, and that's going to produce the biggest hole. So that's going to make, like on this picture here, it's going to make the cactus in focus and the pine trees out of focus. So the cactus is somewhat close, within a 5-foot range or so, and then the trees, the pine trees in the background, are kind of far away, at least 10 feet away, maybe more. The one on the right is the exact opposite, where with the camera set at f16, you want your same position, but now with the cactus in focus and the trees are in focus as well. Now, most cameras go to a higher number than f16. Most cameras will go to 22, some will go to 27, some will go to even 32, depending on the lens and the camera. You don't have to go that high. The difference between f16 and f22 is not substantial as far as how the images will turn out, but it is substantial as far as shutter speed. You're gonna, if you go to f22, you can have some substantial shutter speeds. Just like the sample I showed last week with the fire hose, in that you go to f22, that's a really, really small opening. That may be challenging in certain types of light. Sunny daylight probably won't be a problem, but you're taking pictures like in shade or stuff like that, you can have some problems. Dang it. Oh, okay. I'm gonna take the microphone from that position and move it here and talk just a little bit louder. Hang on a second. There we go. Okay, so part one is I want you to produce a short, or some people call it a shallow depth of field. That means the subject is in focus and the background is out of focus. So produce 2 images showing a short depth of field. This can be done by setting your camera to a long telephoto lens. So for example, a lot of people have cameras that have a lens that's like a 16 to 55 or 18 to 55, somewhere in that range. You'd probably want to set it to 55. So you'd want to zoom in to get this picture. So you can do it with zooming in. You also want to set the aperture to be wide open. Whatever the smallest number your lens is, this is again sort of the confusing part of this, is that you want to have it be whatever the smallest number it can possibly produce. Every lens is different. No wrong answer there, just different lenses do different things. Okay? Make sure that the subject is closer than 5 feet. That doesn't mean 5 inches, but 5 feet. Because like I showed in that one picture, if everything's really far away, that really doesn't demonstrate. Because I'm not, on this particular assignment, I'm not so much concerned about the subject matter. I'm more concerned about your ability to do this technical assignment. So it doesn't really matter what it's of, it's just that I want you to show me the technical concept. Now, this is week 3, we're getting to the halfway point of the class, and we're gonna start to transition into ideas that you're gonna start to portray some concepts outside of technical ideas for the next couple of assignments, okay? And that the background is at least 5 feet away from your subject, okay? So your subject is 5 feet away, the background of them is at least 5 feet away. So for example, if I have my camera set to wide open, like f5.6, and I have someone standing against the wall, that person's gonna be in focus, but so is the wall. So you wanna have them be away from whatever their background is. So standing somebody against the wall doesn't work. So as an example, this is what a Canon camera would look like. You'd want the ISO, the aperture to be f3.2, or what, like I said, every camera is a little bit different. No 2 cameras are the same. No 2 lenses are the same for the most part. You'd want it to be like f3.2, wide open as possible. The shutter speed can vary depending on the light situation that you're in. ISO, you probably want to keep it towards the lower side. You want to be the 1, 2, or 400 speed ISO. If you're going above 400, you probably don't want to do that. You want to just stay in the 1, 2, or 400 range. Okay, so that's what your screen would look like for the most part. There's some other things on the screen that I wouldn't agree with, but we won't go there. Sorry. Okay, the second part of the assignment is to produce a long or deep depth of field. So for example, you want to produce 2 images showing a long depth of field. This can be done to setting your camera to a wide angle lens setting, like 18 millimeters. So like I said, a lot of entry-level SLRs come with a lens that's 18 to 55. For this part of the assignment, it's probably going to be to your benefit to go to 18 to make it a wider shot, okay? And it's a very small aperture, like f16. Can you go to 22 or 27 or 32? Yes, you can. Should you? No. You know, can you eat the entire thing of Ben and Jerry's at night? Yes. Should you? No. So don't really try not to go to f22, because you're not going to see oodles of difference between 16 and 22. And make sure the subject is closer than 5 feet or thereabouts, and that the background is at least 5 feet away. So for example, if you're taking a really cool scenic, if everything is off in the distance, the great picture, probably a great poster maybe, but it may not be illustrating what I'm looking for from this assignment. The idea is that you want to have something close and something far to demonstrate you understand the idea of how to make this work. Okay, hopefully I'm getting that, hopefully that message is sort of resonating. So I'm not sure this really works all that well, but shallow depth of field. So you can see underneath the person, that area between the 2 arrows is the area that's in focus. That's the depth of field. So the area just in front of the subject and just in back of the subject is in focus with a shallow depth of field. So like a wide open aperture, like f4 or something like that, you're going to have that effect. If you do the opposite, where you have like f16, now you can see that arrow underneath the subject where it shows from the plants in front of the subject to the trees behind the subject. Everything's in focus because we have a smaller aperture. So smaller apertures, more depth of field. Okay. The third part of this is macro or close-up. This is by far and away sort of the trickiest one to do. I would recommend doing it last because you're going to change a setting on your camera to make this work. Okay, so I would recommend doing macro last. So produce 2 images showing a macro type of setting. This can be done by setting your camera to a long telephoto, 55 millimeters on the lens. So you want it to be zoom all the way out to where it's a long telephoto, so where you're kind of further away from things a little bit. And you want it to be a wide open aperture, like f5.6, or whatever the smallest number you have. Every lens is different. Here's the tricky part. Here's the stumbling block that's kind of tricky, is you want to put the camera to manual focus, or MF, the thing that Samuel L. Jackson says in all the movies. Okay, so most cameras have a switch on the lens, on the upper, usually on the upper left-hand side of the lens. There's some sort of switch. A lot of times it says AF and MF. If you have a Canon, it says AF and MF. If you have a Nikon, it'll say A and F, and sometimes it can be down at the bottom part of the front of the lens down here. It can be other areas. Other cameras, like my Olympus, I have to go into the menu to change it from autofocus to manual focus. Okay, so for this macro assignment, I can really, really recommend you do this last, because if you forget to put it back, you're gonna have some out of focus pictures. Okay, here's the biggest challenging part. But life is fun when it's challenging at times, right? When you put it on manual focus, you're going to move the camera back and forth until the subject appears in focus through the viewfinder, sometimes as close as an inch or two from the front of the lens. So to demonstrate that, what I would do is I put the camera on manual focus. I have my lens all the way zoomed out. This lens doesn't physically move. And I have it on manual focus. On the turning point of your camera, where you turn to make the camera focus in and out, there's usually little numbers or marks. You want to put it to the closest one. If you turn it to one side, it'll have that infinity mark, that little infinity mark on your lens. If you turn it the other way, it'll turn to numbers. And sometimes those numbers can represent feet or inches, or millimeters, centimeters, and meters and stuff. So you want to be it to, usually most lenses, not every lens, most lenses, you would turn this dial all the way to the right. Okay, so you turn that dial all the way to the right. Not every camera, 90% of them. And then what you're physically going to do is you're going to look through the viewfinder and physically move the camera back and forth until the subject becomes in focus. Once you have the lens zoomed out and the focus of the camera turned the other way, you're going to physically move the camera back and forth until what you're looking at becomes in focus. Most cameras can focus really, really close, a lot closer than you can think. The reason why I want you to stay on manual focus is because trying to get this to autofocus, the camera can see the wrong thing. This way you can get really super, super close to things like leaves and flowers and things like that. So this is actually somewhat easy to do, but the challenge is physically moving the camera back and forth until you see it in focus. Now, here's the caveat. A lot of times, and there's no sin in this, there's no problem with this. A lot of times when people take pictures with their cameras, they're looking at the viewfinder, they're looking at the screen all the time. There's no problem with that, but this macro trick is going to be tough to do that with this screen. It's probably going to be better to look through the viewfinder to do this. Now, here's the extra tricky part, the super duper tricky part. We haven't even breached the trickiest of tricky. Here we go. When you look through the viewfinder, most cameras have what's called a dioptic adjustment, and it's kind of hard to see, but there's a little dial right up here on my camera that has it turns, and there's a little plus and minus symbol. And what that's for is that's for people who wear glasses that are for distance viewing. And the fact that wearing glasses and shooting through a viewfinder like this is kind of tricky because it lets all the light in. So if you wear glasses, you can take your glasses off and adjust this. Okay, but
a lot of times that dial gets misadjusted and you don't realize it because a lot of people just shoot off the screen. So in order to shoot through the viewfinder, to have this assignment work correctly, you may need to adjust this. How do I adjust that, you ask? Perfect, I'm glad you asked that. How you do this is when you're looking through the viewfinder of the camera, you turn the camera on and you just tap the shutter button. When you do that, the numbers will light up inside the viewfinder. When those light up, those numbers should be in focus. And if they're not, you turn this dial until those numbers become in focus. Now, a lot of cameras, when you turn this dial, there's usually a mark that tells you that it's at the halfway point or the 0 point. So you may look for the mark. Not all cameras do that, but you want to adjust this. Adjusting this does not adjust the focus of the camera in any way, shape, or form. It's just a convenience for you. Now, my own personal belief, I try not to be too old school or too, locked into the idea of old world photography, but I think looking through the viewfinder has its benefits over the screen, because when we shoot through the screen, a lot of times if you're shooting through the screen, it's like shooting with your phone. And if you're shooting with your phone, you not only see your phone, but you sort of see everything else in the world. You can't really concentrate on what you're shooting because you're seeing, oh, there's Steve over there and my dog's about to run away, or whatever the situation is, right? Whereas if you're looking through the viewfinder, now it's sort of concentrated. It's sort of tunnel vision effect to where you can concentrate on what you're trying to create more than the world around you, okay? So I would practice this before you start shooting the assignment. And as always, if you have any issues, please let me know and I'll gladly step you through it without any problems whatsoever. Okay, so let me get out of the slideshow and go back to me. Oh, I just love Zoom. I love Zoom. Okay, so a couple things. Like I said, adjusting the viewfinder of the camera, adjusting the camera to where it works correctly is going to be the challenge. And again, if you have any issues whatsoever, don't hesitate to let me know. Okay, please let me know this. I will have the videos for weeks 1 and 2 up sometime in the next couple hours. It's weird when you, I don't know how experienced you are, but when you go to upload, Zoom takes a little while to record. It's YouTube though. YouTube takes like forever to upload a video. It's uploaded, but they have to check it for copyright and stuff. Anywho, I digress. Let's talk about the 4th of July. I'm not going to make this assignment, but just an assignment, but just in case you're interested in the 4th of July fireworks concept, some of what we're doing today can apply toward the 4th of July stuff. 2 parts can really apply. Number 1 is the manual focus. In the 4th of July, trying to get your camera to focus in a really dark situation can be challenging, and the camera can resist wanting to be focused. So if you're taking pictures on the 4th of July with your SLR camera, best bet would be a tripod. That would be the best bet. If you don't have a tripod, there's some solutions. Number 1 is things like bean bags or other things you can sort of prop it onto. You can get tripods pretty inexpensively. I'm not advocating going out and buying a couple $100 tripod. That's not what I'm advocating. But there are resources. There's thrift stores, and I guarantee you every single thrift store that I've ever been to seems to have tripods sitting around. So that's a possibility. Maybe your parents or friends or uncle, whatever, maybe someone has a tripod. So let's go back to the fireworks. Number 1 is you'd want to have the camera set to, when you change the focusing ring, you'd want that to be on that little infinity setting, that sideways 8, because everything's going to be, the fireworks are going to be a distance away. So you want it to be on that infinity setting. Zoom is going to change between, the zoom of your lens is going to, depending on your composition. I think fireworks are better when you have something in the foreground, whether it be a building, a bridge, whatever. But the effect comes from the shutter speed. Okay, so you'd probably want it to be your shutter speed. You probably have to put the camera to M or manual setting. And you'd probably want to be shooting wide open, like f4, 4.5, something like that. But you'd want to have your shutter speed be between ½ second to 5 seconds. The longer the shutter speed, the more cascading effect that the fireworks are going to have. Okay, so if you go for like ½ second, it'll have the burst. If you go for like 2 or 3 seconds, you'll have not only the burst, but you'll have the sort of draping of how the fireworks drape down and stuff like that. Okay, so there's some ideas for that. on how to make that work. The last little thing before we wrap up is focus, how your camera autofocuses. It's hard to demonstrate this through Zoom. If we could be face to face, it would make it a lot easier. But when you're focusing, your camera focuses with contrast. So if you're aiming the camera at something that does not have contrast, the camera sort of resists it. And so what happens is if you go to focus on something that doesn't have any contrast, what happens is the camera won't focus and it won't beep. Of course, now my camera's not beeping. There we go. That little beep tone. So that's why I think having that beep tone turn on is really handy, because if you don't get that beep tone and your camera goes zzz, 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 makes that noise and it sort of focuses back and forth and back and forth, that means the camera can't see what it's looking at. So that happens for a couple different reasons. That happens partially because maybe you're in a lower light situation and the camera can't physically see what's going on. A lot of cameras have little lights on the front of the camera up here sometimes to sort of illuminate or help the camera focus. So you might see like a light coming on, the camera's trying to struggle to focus. The other thing that cameras can get kind of wonky on trying to focus is the fact that they focus with contrast. So if I aim my camera at the background I have back here, Spider-Man, or whatever, the camera, there's all sorts of things for the camera to see, whether it be the shelves or the TV or whatever, it can focus on that. But if you're aiming at something that has very low contrast, like a wall, right there, well, it's hard to do that backwards, isn't it? When you focus on something that doesn't have any contrast, like a blank wall, oftentimes camera can go, I don't see it, because it doesn't have any contrast. So your best bet, again, I can't overemphasize this enough, is to look through the viewfinder and keep pressing the button. If you don't get that beep tone, let up and press it again. If you're not getting anything else, you press that button halfway down and nothing's happening, there's a good chance you might have the camera on the manual focus setting, or MF, and you want to switch it back to autofocus other than the macro shots we're talking about this week. Those are sort of the biggest stumbling blocks I sometimes see people have. They're like, I don't know why every picture I shot's out of focus. It's because maybe they didn't realize that the switch was switched from autofocus to manual focus, and they didn't switch it back. Because if you're on manual focus, the camera will shoot all day. But if you're on autofocus and the camera can't see what it's looking at, the camera will not take a picture. So sometimes that's kind of a handy thing. Okay. So does anybody have any questions on things? You can type into the chat. And just as we're waiting for that, if there's any questions, a couple of minor things that are coming up. This week, I will have the quiz will be correct this time. And also too, starting next week, this is only a 6-week class. And so that means we're halfway done almost. So with that, next week, I'll be giving out the final project, but it's a project that lasts a little while. It takes a couple weeks because I found over time that if I just dump the final project on you for the final week, it's not as successful. People don't get as much. So what I do is I give you a final project, but I give you a couple weeks and I give you check-in points to do it. So I don't want to just throw it at you and say, yeah, figure it out. I want to give it to you and help you through the process to make sure you understand what we're talking about and what we can do and stuff like that. Okay. So any questions? Bueller, no questions. Okay, well, I'm going to wrap it up then. If you guys have any questions, or ladies as well, if you have any questions at all, please do not hesitate to ask me. I apologize about the issues I've been having with Canvas. Hopefully that's fixed finally. But I'm always going to be available through email and through my texting. Please don't hesitate to get a hold of me. Okay, other than that, we're wrapping up, and I will see you hopefully next Monday morning, and we'll talk to you later. Bye. Oh, wait, we don't have to do this exactly. Now, that's been the challenge for me. So yes, I'll make sure that you guys, the four of you, don't have to do the discussion, and it won't count against you. Okay, so good question. But no, you don't have to do any discussions. If you're at the live things, you don't have to do that. No, you're more than welcome. Great. Okay, we'll see you next Monday. And like I said, if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to ask me. I'm here to help you. Okay, great. And I'll see you next Monday.